Hi everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of Theory Crafting Thursday. I'm gonna try to summarize my thoughts on like defensive exercises and fast Tetris. This isn't really like a downstacking guide. My ideas for like a downstacking guide would probably be something similar to my stacking guide, concept-wise. But it's not really solid yet, so I'll probably get to that at some point. I don't know. But first, I gotta announce my daily cheese challenge, which is gonna start on February 15th. We did this last year too, but basically the idea is that every day you have to complete a least blocks cheese race, a 100-line cheese race under a threshold based on your PB. And you do that every day for 2 weeks because, 2 weeks is how long they say it takes to form a habit. And if you complete this challenge, you'll be entered into a raffle for this Mr. Cheese plushie, which I know from experience is very cute and very soft. It's also just like a fun thing to do. People had a lot of fun with it last year, and you can have people to talk about with this very niche exercise. So you can join my Discord here for details to be released shortly. So first, I got to talk about some theory as I do. I think defense too often gets like equated just with your downstacking ability, and downstacking is also not usually described well. So first, downstacking, very obvious component of defense, is just your ability to clear garbage. So it's basically just stacking. It's like the same processes. It's all all about like the processing power that I talked about last time, and the related processes. But one thing that people don't talk about often is that there's different patterns required for downstacking, say like cheese versus double or triple garbage, as well as stuff like counting to 4, which is kind of under this second part, which second component of defense, which I think people don't talk about as much as as its own sub skill. They think of this more as like a timing or macro thing. It's canceling. Right, so canceling I'm defining as your ability to clean up your stack or the garbage with attacks, right? So the skill part of canceling obviously is, finding these attacks, which is part of your vision or your processing power. But also building up a really good habit of finding the next solution while you wait to cancel, and also like having the intuition to know when it's a good time to cancel by, your general feel of you can either just look at your opponent's board to see like when they're approximately going to send their next attack. Do you have time to just downstack now? Because that's usually just a better thing versus waiting to cancel and letting your opponent potentially build up more. Yeah, I think the big thing there is that a lot of people don't realize is that canceling is itself a skill or a habit that you have to build up. I think when I first started practicing my defense, I noticed that when I canceled, I just kind of turned my brain off while I waited for the garbage to come. No downtime. You gotta use up as much as you can. Yeah. So next, this is just my theory background. Now we're gonna talk about the exercises. But first, a little more background. What I think makes a good exercise, or what the criteria which I'm gonna be judging these exercises based off of. The first is your ability to push yourself with the exercise. So first, what utilities do you have to tailor the exercise to your skill level, right? So you always want to be putting yourself at the edge of your comfort zone. It's not going to be an exercise that's too difficult for you or exercise that's too easy for you. So how adaptable is the exercise to your skill level? Second is, what statistics do you have to measure your performance by, versus how much do you just kind of have to feel how good you're doing. This is like a stat that you can latch onto to equate your performance to. And secondly, what does the exercise actually practice? How niche is the exercise? As I was kind of getting at before, cheese garbage isn't a complete downstacking kind of thing. It's something it's probably the most potent kind of, or the most annoying kind of garbage to deal with. So it's good to know how to do it. And also generally, if you have the vision to go through cheese garbage, you will have the vision to go through all types of garbage, but you know, it's still, you won't be able to latch onto those patterns necessarily as much. So that's like, cheese is technically niche in that way. Versus more general exercises, which are closer to verse, and yeah, they're more easily applicable to verses. But one thing I feel is that people tend to gravitate towards exercises that replicate verses, right? They like to go towards like playing against bots, or playing the game as though they were like playing like an exercise as though it was verses, and like approaching playing the exercise as though it was verses. And I think that's sort of misguided. Like, if you wanted to play verses, you should just play verses. Obviously, there are places for exercises that do replicate verse. I just think that there are oftentimes that people ignore exercises that don't replicate verse because they don't see how it's immediately applicable, which I think is a bit of a shame. And the final criteria is, what skill range do you need to be in for the exercise to be effective? And this is sort of related to how adaptable an exercise is to your skill level. There's some exercises on here that I think are pretty effective, but are just unfortunately too niche for like a certain group of players, right? Well, and I think that it'll be more obvious as we get along what I'm talking about. So first, the big boy, cheese race, but specifically playing cheese race for time. So in terms of what you can do to like tweak the exercise to your skill level, I mean, it's just like you're playing for time. It's like sprint. Anyone can play it. It's always useful. And as for stats you can look at, obviously you can look at the time, but there's also like pace scripts that can help you figure out how efficient you're playing at any given moment, and you know, obviously the block count at the end. I think cheese race, especially like speed cheese, at least in my personal experience, can be kind of difficult to get into because it's confusing how much you should be putting into your speed or efficiency. But this is definitely not a problem for other players. So it's, you know, it's just like this is all just kind of feel-based thing. I'm not really giving a super opinion on like what is best, but more my opinions on the value of each exercise. So yeah, so I think people really hate this mode, especially 100 line, but I also think that there's too much variance in 10 line and 18 line, especially for cheese. I really don't see anyone grinding like 10 line and 18 line cheese, and that's for a reason. And finally, there's arguably lots of variance in 100 line too, especially for speed, where you have to kind of skip over some efficient, like verifying that your solution is efficient because of, you know, you're playing for speed. So you might like lock into lower block counts. But you know, like obviously the best players that like play efficiently and very quickly, like Reviclia, like he'll get those low block runs no matter what, right? And there's also like PB running versus average running or whatever. But you know, this is something I've considered. I have a sneaking suspicion that 100 line is also very, very like variable, but even for least blocks. But you know, it's something I would have to do more research on. And then finally, or naturally, comes next is the elephant in the room, slow cheese race. I don't know how controversial it is now, but I think there was a time where like people would argue about whether or not slow cheese was useful. I think it swung both ways at some point, where people would like over recommend slow cheese, and nowadays I think people like, and then there was like a time where people thought slow cheese was like useless, or maybe it's just the opinions I was around. But you know, nowadays I try to keep like a pretty rounded view on this. So playing slow cheese means you're playing only for the least block, so you're focusing only on your downstacking efficiency, like downstacking with as few pieces as possible. And the same caveats as for fast cheese apply, like, you know, the only practices cheese, and you know, it's a lot of variance in 10 and 18 line. But the effectiveness range is what I think is probably the most opinionated thing that I have on here. I think slow cheese is only effective if your PB, if you can do like under 400 and it stops being effective for like actual like versus practice or defense practice once you can get 250, like a 250 block run like without trying, and like obviously you're still playing like slowly, but like it's like almost unthinkable for you to get above 250 blocks when you're trying your hardest. So yeah, I like at a point when you're playing at like 0.5 PPS, if you guys remember, like I talked about last time, where when you're trying to push your processing power, it's like you have to get yourself at the edge of the, you have to push, like it's hard to tell when you're pushing your efficiency that high, that much higher when you're playing at like 0.5 PPS versus 0.6 PPS, but like it's just like playing slower is even slower and slower and slower is more just to ensure that you get the correct solution rather than like really pushing yourself to see more solutions, at least in my experience. And I am a I have a very low least blocks PB, and I will say for me, least blocks cheese is separate from like versus practice, like the other exercise I'm going to be mentioning here, and it's more just kind of a fun exercise for me now, like a thought exercise, focus exercise, kind of like how people run most PCs, most TSDs for for those modes. It's just very like purely single player Tetris, and I don't necessarily think everyone needs to get to that point. I think that least blocks can be a lot easier to get into because you're only focusing on efficiency instead of worrying about focusing on efficiency and speed. But also people are really impatient, and they really like they play Tetris to like move their hands fast. So I can understand why people wouldn't like doing this, but I think it's a lot more of a focused exercise, a lot more of a niche exercise. This starts to get into that point where I say that people kind of value versus applicability, immediate versus applicability too high when they're looking at what exercises they want to do. So that's just my 2 cents. As I said last time, like when you're pushing efficiency or you're pushing speed, in my opinion, it's just the same thing, right? It's just you're working on those processes of looking at the queue and putting them onto the board and trying out lots of different solutions. It's just a matter of whether you're trying to try solutions faster or try more solutions. But I think because of how complicated cheese can be, or like downstacking can be, because there's like a lot out of your control, you have to look at a lot more, like you have to look at the garbage. It's a lot easier to push like efficiency in downstacking, I think, because there's a lot more opportunities to be, it's a lot more granular to be efficient. And I think especially with the block count, it's well, like I said before, there's I think a lot more variability than people, or variance that people realize in least blocks cheese, but I think it's still one of the most like precise measures we have of efficiency that people can latch onto when they're doing an exercise. Like when you're latching onto like PPB in Ultra, or like TSDs and TST, I don't know, people don't play that mode, like PPB in Ultra or whatever the equivalent is in Blitz, like it's not like it's not really obvious what one solution is better than the other, because like the difference is between like this like TSD solution will be like more flexible on more queues, but if you just happen to get the right queue, your PPB won't change at all, even though you did kind of a bad stacking decision and got bailed out by queue. That takes the awareness. It requires your awareness of the stack, versus if you're just a new player that's looking to develop that awareness, you don't have a stat to latch onto because PPB isn't as precise. I think like downstacking it's easier to push efficiency in that way, because like it's a lot more obvious when what is the best solution. Like you'll get screwed over in the next solution if your stack is bad for downstack. After a bad downstack solution, way more often, because like cues are a lot more specific. I don't know if that makes sense. You guys can ask questions about that in the comments, but that's my idea on slow cheese race, and that was my argument for why it's a good exercise. I can still see why people don't like it though. So next up is medium cheese. This is more niche. I don't see a lot of people doing this. And I think it's only really effective once you're like past the slow cheese. Like you can't play slow cheese anymore. Like once 250 can be achieved easily, because the idea here is you want to play at like a medium speed for least blocks, right? Like I guess you kind of, there's a few ways to go about it. One way is to like latch yourself to a specific speed and then try and get as low blocks as possible, or the other way around, right? Like you try and go as fast as possible to get below a certain block count, or like get a decent block count, right? I think like people usually tend to do the latter and latch onto a number like 250 or like sub 250, because you know that's kind of like I think the reason I chose the number 250 here is because it's like a pretty common benchmark. Like yeah, I'm pretty efficient with like cheese rates. Like I'm above the norm, even though like sub 300 is kind of like the okay, I'm decent at this. It's 250 is kind of like the okay, I'm good at this, I guess. But the problem with or not problem, but the caveat with medium cheese is that yeah, you need to be at this high level, I think, for it to be useful, because it's a lot more difficult to notice. Like you need to have had enough runs in to notice when you're playing efficiently, because when you're staying at like a higher speed, it's hard to, you know, keep track of your pace, that kind of thing. You kind of need to have this sense for okay, I'm playing good versus like I need to play a little faster. It's just there's a lot more you need to be in tune with, as opposed to being able to latch on to stats. Same with fast cheese. I think medium cheese is kind of like efficiency focused fast cheese, in that you have to focus on both speed and efficiency. It's a lot more complicated, I think, to run. And it's like, what stat are you even trying to push down, right? It's not like you're looking at PBs, or I guess you can be looking at averages or looking at thresholds or that kind of thing. You really just have to know what you're capable of, what is pushing yourself, and I think it's a very self-directed exercise, right? And you know, self-directed exercises can be hard to stay motivated with, so you know, I think it is still a pretty good exercise though, but it just has those caveats. Next up, the last of our, you know, default gestress single player modes is survival, where you just play for time. I think this is good because it's like mixed cheese, but it's less subjective. Like you're forced to play at least like this speed plus efficiency value. You have to be enough to counteract 1 garbage per second. But it's like less subjective, because like you're not setting the pace. It's setting the pace. Like yes, you have to play at a combined speed and efficiency of 1 garbage per second, and but the problem is that it's really only useful if you can actually do that, right? Because you can't tweak that garbage per second. So if you can play above like 2 minutes, I think it's worth grinding. Which is like not a significant portion of the player base. And it also stops being useful once you can get like an hour, I guess, if you're like Firestorm or CZ. So this is like not useful to like 3 people. But yeah, survival is definitely more niche, and I think like it is like once you're at that level, you definitely want to be focusing on more things. Like you don't need to play as niche of exercise, because like you're good enough to just have a sense for when you're downstacking well. You don't really need to develop any new downstacking patterns, but it's still a good exercise, I think. Especially because like it has a more directed like stat of time, a more precise stat of time, plus it's like, you know, it's a default game mode. You don't need to think too hard about like setting your own thresholds or whatever for medium, for like the medium cheese or whatever. So next up, we're gonna start to get into like Tetrio game modes, I guess. Or I'm pretty much only gonna talk about Zen. Zen cheese layer is the first one. This is my, if you guys were around during my coaching phase, this was my like default recommendation TM, where I said play 30% messiness, 10 height cheese layer. So I think it's one of the best, like the most approachable exercise for people that haven't really thought about focusing on downstacking or defense. But there's no stats with it, and like it's just to kind of like demonstrate the ability. And I think it's one of those things that like if you think someone's going to be too impatient for cheese, or you're not necessarily sure if they're going to be committed to the game enough yet to like want to really sit down and grind and look at numbers and stats, like you have to read that they're not that kind of person. They just like playing versus. I usually think it's just good to recommend this to someone as a warm-up versus doing like sprint or something. And at least get them in the mindset of downstack or looking at garbage before they get into their TL games. So this is effective, I think, at every level, but it's just kind of a warm-up thing because there's no stats to look at. But the next one, Cheese Timer, where you're playing for time, I think is a very underutilized exercise. I think it's easily the most flexible exercise in here. It's very, very adjustable because you can make the speed decimals, you can, you know, tweak the messiness. I think it's still good to go like 30 to 50 messiness. There was a time where I was practicing this and I would do like a set of runs at 30 messiness and also a set of runs at 50 messiness. This is basically just like a better survival mode where it practices like, you know, non-cheese downstacking patterns. And like it also forces you to play at a specific like garbage per second, right? Like total effective downstacking versus thinking totally about the efficiency or speed, like or like figuring out which one to push to get a better time. You're just straight up just downstack. You just go crazy. But yeah, the problem with both of these cheese layer and cheese timer is that they don't really have any. The stats and the data tracking are really minimal. I guess you could keep your own like spreadsheet for this if you want to just play for time. You could play for APM or something too with this, but I think it's not really useful because then you're just kind of playing it like verse, which I'll get into later about why I don't think these defense exercises are good for verse. Like single player defense exercises are good for like, replicating verse. But yeah, I think this is effective at every level. I think probably more leaning towards the advanced, like U and above kind of players. And I think it also was more effective pre-no pass-through because like there's no canceling in this. And it's like garbage is constantly appearing on your board, which is a little like it's off the pace of usual Tetris where you have time to think and breathe. But that was kind of how no pass like pass-through Tetris was, right? So it's I think it was definitely one of the best exercises you could do during that time, but we're past it a little bit. I think it's still good because you can tweak it a lot better than the exercise I'm going to mention now, which I think is a slightly better version of it if it were more tweakable, which is the APM survival cycles. You play for time. I think it's useful at all levels, with the only caveat that it's only tweakable in intervals of 30 unless someone decides to go in and make it for a bunch of other APMs. Right now it's only like 30 to 120. I've mentioned it on here a few times in different videos. Like again, there's less PB and data tracking because it's a custom user mode instead of an actual single player mode. But it's the only exercise, like pure single player exercise on here that has canceling. So I think not enough players practice this habit of canceling, and I guess like I spent like 20 minutes talking about other exercises to finally get here, but you know, you got to focus on building up that habit of like looking for your next DS solution while waiting to cancel. That alone made me like probably like go from losing to certain players to just winning against them because like I was so annoying to kill, right? If I can just have that extra time to think for a downstack solution, I'll usually find it, right? And like finding these like clean TSDs where I can just kind of wait for my opponent's next attack, cancel it, and I'm totally safe during that time to just think. Huge game changer for my defense. So I really recommend this, and then like the place I practiced this was in like 120 APM survival. So definitely really recommend this to a lot of like you and above players, or really anyone, but like I think it's most like that kind of thing can probably like give you that little bump to like jump a few like maybe don't quote me on that, but like few hundred TR, definitely a few hundred TR if you get that down. But I think that there's a few caveats with this exercise. The first is that messiness will mess with your ability to determine if you're getting cheese or clean. So it'll force you. The exercise is kind of encouraging you to only cancel, which is if you're not playing any verses besides this mode, because I know some people like they don't like playing TL, so they just kind of get themselves into single player modes that are like verses, and this used to be one of them that people played. You're gonna force yourself to only do canceling, and canceling only is bad. Like, I guess using myself as an example again here, like when I was grinding the 120 APM survival, when I wasn't playing against opponents that were like really big APM spammers and are constantly like adding clean to the game for me to kind of just like downstack back, I would just lose because I couldn't send enough, or like I couldn't time my counter spikes well enough, and like, you know, other stuff that I'm not gonna talk about right now because this video is getting pretty long already. Just trying to focus on defense here, but you can't play this mode as though it reverses. You have to just treat it as like I'm playing only to live as long as possible, and you can't pretend it's anything more than that, and that's fine, right? Like, it doesn't need to replicate verses. And next we're going to talk about modes that actually replicate verses, kind of. So versus turn-based bots, I think there's a few caveats with this exercise that I stopped practicing it as much. First, I think it's overly focused on piece efficiency. It excludes you from a lot of game-winning spikes in real time if you executed them really quickly. Because like if I do like a TSD, like I do like TSD Tetris and have a really immediate solution for the next TSD into like downstacking to another Tetris, maybe that's like 10-15 pieces, but I would be able to execute that in like a second. Wait, maybe that's not, maybe like 3 seconds, 4 seconds. I'm not that fast, and that would kill like someone, but like a real player if we were playing real time, or even a bot in real time. But the problem is that in turn-based, the bot also gets to like do a complex downstack at the same speed that you're playing, right? So it basically just nullifies a really good spike in real-time play. So I think it gives you focusing on weird spikes, and also like really complicated combos that you might see in turn-based that would send a lot of damage for the amount of pieces that you place, but you did it at like 1 PPS, so your opponent lived anyway, right? Like when I was playing a lot of turn-based versus like turn-based against like Misa, I would find like these 10 combos in verse, so I did them at 1 PPS, and like my opponent just didn't die. Yeah, I think it's still a fun though if you want to like work on maybe finding patterns in those complicated DS combos, or you know, focusing on APP or like a sandbox to work on your like receiving, that kind of thing, because you have as much time as you want to consciously work through decisions. And yeah, again, there's also data tracking is locked behind payment again. It's locked behind payment if you want to play this mode on Gestress and like save your matches. Yeah, you have to be a supporter. Next is playing bots real time. I think this is a lot more difficult to tune than people think, like because people aren't super sure on like what level of bot they want to be playing against. Like, should you be winning most of the time? Should it be like you have to go like 10-10 against the bot every time? Because your own performance is variable. But that kind of gets into why like bots are like the argument for playing against bots is that bots will play the same every single day, and humans do not. And the problem is that you do not. So what will be effective practice for you one day may not be the next day, because like you're playing a little worse, so you need to be playing a little bit worse of a bot, or a little better of a bot, that kind of thing. They have very little variance to how they play, and like they'll kind of play the same all the time. Like they don't play like people. One like little peeve I have is I don't understand why people play against Cold Clear, because Cold Clear is like the farthest from like playing a real person as possible. It will send you only clean, and like only like it will never die, but it will send you as much clean as you want, so you get like kind of that like ego boost of my APP is so high, I'm like sending so many like clean spikes, I'm downstacking like full boards because it's just like one line of garbage. I don't know, I think people should play against like the less optimal bots like Misa, or maybe Freybot. I haven't played against Freybot. I play Misa. But yeah, that's my thing. And I think like it's you know, just like find people to play against, even if it's like less consistent practice. It wouldn't, you know, it's just make friends. Okay, I think this has kind of gone long enough, so I'm just gonna rush through the discussion. So first, obviously, there's not really a perfect exercise. I gave caveats for every single one of these. I think you can call into question the value I place on like niche practice, and like whether or not like an exercise should replicate verse as much as possible. And in that usually leads to like the most common target of that is like slow modes, like turn-based verses, or like slow cheese. But yeah. Finally, one thing I sort of touched on, but I think I wanted to bring a little more attention to, is that like the value of these statistics that help you, like, that you can latch onto, like least blocks in least blocks cheese, or I'm gonna stop flicking around the slides, like least blocks in your block count in least blocks cheese, or you're just like your time in like cheese race, like I think an important thing is to be able to notice your level of gameplay, or be in tune with how well you're doing at any point. And a lot of exercises become better, or like you can even just like focus on things in verses and like become better if you have a really good sense of how well you're doing at any point. So a lot of people will call into question like, why are we even doing these exercises? For like, why are we compromising on these exercises? That because they have like better statistics, if we could just play regular verses and stay in tune with how well we're doing. I think it's because a lot of people don't have that ability, and a good way to build it up is to have a statistic and compare it to your own perceived performance. And if that doesn't line up, then you kind of use that to inform your perception. Like I know there's times when I'm playing cheese race and I feel like I'm playing pretty efficiency, and then I take pretty efficiently, and then I take a look at my pace and I'm like, oh, I'm playing at like 350 pace. Oh. But yeah, maybe that's just unique to me. I don't know what other people think about this topic. Definitely, you know, ask questions, or like call me a loser, you know, call me out on some of my opinions in the comments below, or my Discord server. Yep, I think that's all I got for you guys. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe. Don't forget to come to my Discord and sign up for daily cheese. It's gonna be a lot of fun. See you guys.